For decades, the boggy corner of Arthur Pemberton's sheep pasture was a joke. When the 67-year-old retired mechanic decided to dig, the ridicule was relentless. But he discovered a line in his grandfather's diary, buried it in the bog before the surveyors came. On the 12th day of peeling back black peat, his bucket struck something that rang like iron. By nightfall, the entire village had gone quiet. Arthur Pemberton wasn't looking for treasure. He was looking for something his grandfather had buried in 1936, something that had no business being in a Welsh sheep pasture. And what he pulled from that hole would force an entire village to reckon with a secret it had kept quiet for nearly a century. The diary belonged to his grandfather, William Pemberton, a man Arthur had known only as a silent figure who sharpened plow blades and never spoke about the years before 1940. Arthur found the diary in a rusted tin box at the back of the farmhouse attic, wrapped in oilcloth and buried under a stack of old seed catalogs. Most of the entries were mundane, whether notes, a sick ewe, the price of paraffin. But every few pages the same line appeared, always in the same shaky pencil strokes. Buried it in the bog before the surveyors came. They'll never think to look there. Arthur showed the diary to his nephew David, who ran the village pub. David flipped through the pages and handed it back with a shrug. "You're chasing ghosts, uncle," he said. "That bog been swallowing fence posts since before I was born." The locals were less polite. At the Crown and Anchor, men who had farmed the valley for generations laughed into their pints. "Half an acre of mud," they said, and a retired mechanic with a shovel and a diary like a bad detective novel. The land itself seemed to agree with them. Every winter the bog rose and swallowed whatever sat too close. A tractor had sunk to its axles there in 1972. The farmer who owned it before Arthur gave up trying to drain it and just fenced it off. But the diary had one more thing Arthur hadn't shared with anyone. The final entry, dated October 19, 1936, included a small, folded map, a rough sketch of the pasture with an X marked in the boggy corner. Beneath the X, in letters pressed so hard the pencil had nearly torn the paper, William had written, "No one must know it's here, not until it's time." Arthur didn't know what time his grandfather meant, but the quiet certainty in those words had kept him awake for 3 nights straight. He rented the tracked excavator from a hire yard 2 towns over, paying cash so the booking wouldn't become pub gossip. He started digging on a Tuesday morning in late March, alone, with a thermos of tea, and the map folded in his coat pocket. For 11 days, the machine chewed through peat that stank of centuries, coughing up nothing but black water and the roots of alder trees that had been dead for decades. Each evening, Arthur climbed down, caked in mud, and the crowd at the fence line would thin out, shaking their heads. His nephew David stood watching one evening and said, "Uncle, you're going to find a broken plow blade and a century's worth of rain. Go home." On the 12th day, with the excavator's tracks slipping in the slurry, Arthur saw the crowd had grown larger. Word had spread that the old man was still at it, and now a few teenagers were filming on their phones. Arthur ignored them and kept digging. The bucket plunged into a new patch of peat and stopped dead against something solid. The shock rang through the machine's arm like a bell. He reversed the bucket and swung it aside, then cut the engine. In the sudden silence, he could hear the laughter from the fence line falter. He climbed down into the hole, his boots sinking to the knee, and pushed aside clumps of peat with his bare hands. The mud slid away to reveal a curve of unpainted iron. Not a pipe, not a rock. A shape so deliberate, so clearly manufactured, that his breath caught in his throat. He scraped lower, and there, caked in rust but unmistakable, was the graceful slatted grille of a motor car. A grille he recognized instantly from his decades as a mechanic. It belonged to a Rolls-Royce that had been reported stolen 2 weeks before his grandfather buried it. And the car, according to every record Arthur could find, had never been seen again. The Rolls-Royce wasn't just any motor car. Arthur, who had spent 40 years under the hoods of Fords and Austins, recognized the aristocratic sweep of a phantom II Continental. Only 281 were ever built, each one a hand-finished masterpiece that cost more than most men earned in a decade. And this one had been sitting under 12 feet of peat for 87 years. its chrome still catching the March light when he wiped the mud away with his sleeve. He didn't touch anything else. He climbed out of the hole, drove into the village, and called the county archaeologist from the phone box outside the post office. The operator patched him through, and the man on the other end listened for about 10 seconds before telling Arthur to stop digging immediately. Then he said he would be there in 2 hours. By the time the archaeologist's Land Rover pulled up, the crowd at the fence line had swelled. Word had traveled faster than Arthur's mud-caked boots could carry him. The teenagers who had been filming earlier were now streaming live, and somewhere in the signal chain, a local news crew picked up the story. Within 24 hours, the video clips had racked up hundreds of thousands of views. A rusty grill emerging from a Welsh bog, the old man kneeling in the mud like a pilgrim at a shrine. The internet, as it always does, split into 2 camps: those who thought it was a magnificent hoax and those who wanted to know whose body might be in the trunk. The archaeologist, a careful man named Dr. Rhys Morgan, brought a team the next morning. They set up a grid, cataloged the stratigraphy, and began the slow, meticulous work of excavating the car as if it were a Roman coffin. Arthur watched from the fence, the same fence where the villagers had stood laughing 2 weeks earlier. They weren't laughing now. The first thing the team found inside the car was not a body. It was a leather Gladstone bag sitting on the passenger seat, the hide blackened and brittle but still intact. They opened it under a tent, away from the cameras, and found a cache of documents wrapped in an old rubberized map. Birth certificates, a marriage license, a set of discharge papers from the Royal Welsh Fusiliers dated 1918, and a small velvet pouch containing a woman's wedding ring, 3 gold sovereigns, and a folded letter. The letter was addressed to a man named Thomas Ellis of Penwybont Farm, who had been Arthur's grandfather's closest friend. It was dated September 15, 1936, and it opened with a sentence that made the entire team go cold. If you are reading this, the truth can no longer hurt the living. The car, they soon learned, had indeed been reported stolen on October 1, 1936, but it had not been stolen by William Pemberton. It had been stolen by Thomas Ellis, a decorated war veteran and the son of the wealthiest landowner in the county, Sir Reginald Ellis. Sir Reginald had bought the Phantom II new in 1933, and by the autumn of '36, he was on the verge of ruin. The Depression had gutted his holdings, and the tax surveyors were combing the valley, valuing assets for a forced liquidation. Sir Reginald had planned to sell the car to raise cash, but Thomas had other ideas. He took the rolls in the dead of night, intending to hide it until the surveyors left, then return it, saving his father's dignity. Instead, he crashed it into a ditch on the lane above Pemberton's pasture. The chassis cracked, the grille smashed, and Thomas, bleeding from a head wound, staggered to William's door in the rain. William Pemberton was a blacksmith and a mechanic, the sort of man who could fix anything with a hammer and a fire. But even he could not mend a bent Phantom II frame without parts and a workshop that didn't exist in rural Wales in 1936. The surveyors were due in 3 days. Sir Reginald's reputation, and by extension, Thomas's future, hung on the car not being found. So William and Thomas did the only thing they could think of. They hitched a team of horses to the wreck, dragged it deep into Pemberton's bog, and let the ground swallow it. Thomas reported it stolen, the police filed a report, and the insurance company eventually paid out a sum that kept Sir Reginald afloat long enough to lose the estate in a card game 2 years later anyway. The secret held. Thomas went to his grave in 1952, Sir Reginald in 1958, and William Pemberton in 1963. None of them ever spoke of it again. The diary was the only record. And the diary, as Arthur now understood, had been a message in a bottle, waiting for the moment when the last person who could be harmed by the truth was dead. Arthur sat in the farmhouse kitchen the night after the Gladstone bag was opened, the letter spread on the table, and cried for a man he had never really known. The grandfather who sharpened plow blades and never smiled had, at the age of 41, buried a Rolls-Royce in his own pasture to protect a friend, and then kept that silence for 27 years. The village, which had mocked Arthur for 3 weeks, now faced a different kind of reckoning, because the car was not just a relic. It was evidence that the richest family in local memory had been saved by a blacksmith nobody remembered. And that revelation was about to pull open a door that some people in the valley still preferred to keep closed. The car, Dr. Morgan announced 3 days later, was not merely intact. It was astonishingly well preserved. The peat, acidic and anaerobic, had swaddled the Phantom II in a chemical environment that slowed rust to a near standstill. The leather seats were still recognizable. The walnut dashboard, though warped, still bore the ghost of its original varnish. The odometer read 42,000 miles, meaning it had been driven for less than a decade before it went underground. A classic car valuation expert who flew in from London took one look at the emerging chassis and delivered his verdict live on BBC Wales. If the engine could be freed and the bodywork stabilized, this vehicle would be worth somewhere in the region of £350,000 at auction, possibly more, given the story attached to it. The moment that figure hit the airwaves, the phone in Arthur's farmhouse began to ring. The first call came from a solicitor representing the Ellis estate, which still existed, it turned out, in the form of a trust managed by Sir Reginald's great-grandson, a man named Edward Ellis who ran a boutique investment firm in Cardiff and had never set foot in the valley. He claimed that because the car had once belonged to his family and had been reported stolen, it remained their property. The insurance payout, he argued, was irrelevant. The law favored the original owner. The second call came from a different solicitor, this one representing an insurance company that had long since been absorbed into a multinational conglomerate. That company had also heard the news, and its legal department, digging through century-old archives with the enthusiasm of a terrier, had located the original claim file. They now asserted subrogation rights, meaning they owned the car because they had paid out Sir Reginald's claim in 1936. Arthur, who had never retained a lawyer in his life, found himself at the center of a three-way legal storm over a motor car he had never driven, never owned, and only discovered because his grandfather had left him a penciled map in a rotting diary. He sat in the Crown and Anchor that evening, staring at a pint he hadn't touched, while David the barman, his nephew, the same one who had called it a fool's errand, stood behind the taps looking shaken. The village had turned, not against Arthur but against the outsiders. The same men who had laughed at the old man digging in the mud were now offering to chip in for a solicitor. They felt, quite suddenly, that the car belonged here, not in a Cardiff boardroom, not in a London auction house. Here in the valley where it had been buried by one of their own. But the legal claims were only the beginning of the trouble. 2 weeks into the excavation, Dr. Morgan's team made a discovery that changed everything. Under the passenger seat, wedged between the cushion and the frame, they found a second leather pouch, smaller than the Gladstone bag and easy to miss in the initial survey. Inside were 6 diamonds, not paste, not costume jewelry. A gemologist brought in from Cardiff confirmed they were high-quality stones, likely cut in Antwerp in the 1920s and worth, conservatively, over £200,000. And here, the story took a very dark turn. The diamonds were not mentioned in William Pemberton's diary. They were not mentioned in Thomas Ellis's letter. No one, apparently, knew they were in the car, except, perhaps, the person who had put them there. And that person, Arthur began to suspect, had not been his grandfather. He searched the diary again, this time reading every entry with the attention of a man who now understood that his grandfather had been hiding more than a single car. On September 29, 1936, William had written, "T came by tonight, very agitated, said things were worse than he'd told me. I told him I didn't want to know more. Better that way." T was Thomas Ellis. William had buried the car for a friend, yes, but he had also deliberately chosen not to learn what else was hidden inside it. Plausible deniability, bought at the cost of a few thousand words a diary, nearly 9 decades ago. The news of the diamonds broke the fragile peace in the village. Edward Ellis, the great-grandson, issued a statement saying that his family had no knowledge of the gems and that their claim on the vehicle remained unaffected. The insurance company's lawyers promptly amended their filing to include the diamonds. And then a fourth party entered the fray. The Crown, represented by the Treasury solicitor, who issued a terse letter pointing out that uncut diamonds found in a stolen vehicle with no clear provenance might legally constitute treasure trove and therefore belong to the state. Arthur, standing in his muddy yard with a solicitor's letter in one hand and a gem valuation in the other, now faced the very real prospect of losing not only the car but his farm. Legal fees alone, win or lose, would run into sums he could not begin to afford. His nephew David organized a community meeting in the pub. The village, for the first time in living memory, closed ranks behind the Pemberton family. They knew the truth now. Arthur's grandfather had buried that car not for profit, but to protect a friend from ruin. And Arthur had dug it up not out of greed, but out of devotion to a diary entry he didn't fully understand. The real question, the one that would determine everything that followed, was whether that kind of loyalty meant anything in a courtroom. And the answer, when it came, would come from a source no one expected. The answer arrived on a Thursday morning in the form of a phone call from a woman named Margaret Holt, the county archivist. She had been following the news like everyone else, and something about the dates had bothered her. Over the weekend, she pulled the old quarter sessions records and found a file that had been misfiled in 1941. It was a sworn deposition from a claims adjuster named Herbert Fry, who had investigated Sir Reginald Ellis's insurance claim in the autumn of 1936. Fry had concluded in writing that the theft had been staged. He noted that Sir Reginald's financial ledgers showed a suspiciously large payment to a London gem dealer just 3 days before the car was reported missing, and that the timing coincided with a police raid on the home of a known diamond smuggler in Mayfair. Fry recommended that the claim be denied and the matter referred to the authorities, but the declaration of war in 1939 buried the case under a mountain of more urgent paperwork, and nobody had ever followed up. The insurance company, Repton Mutual, had been dissolved in 1957. Its liabilities had never been formally transferred, and its subrogation rights were now, in the eyes of the law, extinct. Arthur's solicitor, a young woman named Ceres Bowen, who had taken the case partly out of professional curiosity, and partly because her own grandfather had been a friend of William Pemberton, filed the archivist's findings with the court before the Ellis estate's lawyers could finish their next round of motions. Edward Ellis, cornered by a reporter outside his Cardiff office, was handed a copy of the deposition and stood in the rain reading it for nearly 4 minutes. His great-grandfather had not merely lost the car in a crash. He had likely used the insurance payout to cover his debts while the diamonds, which almost certainly belonged to a smuggling ring with connections to the London underworld, sat hidden under the passenger seat of a vehicle he never intended to recover. Edward issued a statement the following morning. The Ellis family, he wrote, would not pursue its claim. The car and everything it contained belonged in the valley, to the Pembertons. To the village, he would not be giving interviews. The Treasury solicitor was slower to yield, but Ceres Bowen had done her homework. Under the Treasure Act, objects of historical interest found on private land belonged to the finder if they were not deliberately buried with the intent of recovery. The fact that the car had been interred in a bog with no realistic expectation of ever being retrieved was, she argued, precisely the legal standard for lost or abandoned property. The diamonds, though clearly valuable, were part of that abandonment. The Crown, after a tense mediation session that lasted 11 hours, agreed to withdraw its claim in exchange for a full academic study of the find and a permanent public display of a portion of the recovered material. Arthur, who had never asked for any of it, was now the undisputed owner of a phantom II Continental, 6 diamonds, and a story that had already attracted interest from museums in 3 countries. The auction took place 7 months later at the village hall, the same hall where Arthur had once been laughed out of a parish council meeting for requesting drainage advice. The car, carefully lifted from the bog and transported to a restoration workshop in Shrewsbury, had been stabilized but left largely in its recovered condition. The patina of the peat, the ghost of rust on the chrome, the faint imprint of William Pemberton's hand on the grill where he had dragged the wreck, all of it was preserved. The phantom sold to a private collector from Texas for £420,000. The diamonds, auctioned separately, fetched another $230,000. When the gavel fell on the final lot, Arthur did not cheer. He sat at the back of the hall, next to his nephew David, and quietly wiped his eyes. He used the money to pay off the farm's mortgage and set up a trust for the village. The bog, once the punchline of every local joke, was designated a heritage site, and a small interpretative center now stands at the edge of the pasture, telling the story of a blacksmith who buried a secret to protect a friend, and a grandson who dug it up to honor his memory. The diary is on display inside, open to the entry that started it all. And tucked into the back of the display case, in a small velvet pouch that nobody ever mentions in the official guide, is the wedding ring from the Gladstone bag, still waiting, perhaps, for the person it was meant for. What Arthur Pemberton pulled from that bog was never just a motor car. It was a message that took 87 years to be delivered. 3 men, a blacksmith, a soldier, and a bankrupt aristocrat, wrapped a secret in leather and peat and silence, trusting that one day someone would listen. Arthur was the one who finally did, not because he wanted riches or recognition, but because he saw value in an old man's diary when everyone else saw only mud. The village that laughed at him now tells his story to anyone who stops at the interpretative center. The bog that was once a punchline is now a landmark, and the diary, still open to that same entry, reminds every visitor that some truths wait longer than a lifetime to be found. The question it leaves you with isn't about treasure. It's about what you've already dismissed as worthless, what story you've walked past because it looked like nothing worth stopping for. Arthur's grandfather knew that the ground remembers what people forget. Maybe the only difference between a bog and a museum is whether someone cares enough to dig. If this story reminded you that the things we overlook often hold the deepest value, hit subscribe before you leave. Tell us in the comments about a moment when you found something unexpected in an ordinary place. Share this with someone who needs to hear that patience and persistence can turn the most unpromising ground into a legacy. We're here every week with stories that prove the best chapters are sometimes buried right beneath our feet. Thanks for watching.